On July 18, 1969, Massachusetts Senator and fourth son of the Kennedy family, Edward M. Ted Kennedy, was driving with his secretary Mary Jo Kopechne when their car plunged into seawater, killing Kopechne. The incident became known as the Chappaquiddick Incident, after Chappaquiddick Island in Massachusetts, where it occurred. After the accident, only Ted Kennedy escaped and survived. And it became hugely controversial because he didn't report it to authorities until about 10 hours later, when police discovered the body. The car crashed in very shallow water, and Mary Jo was believed to have survived for 30 minutes to 2 hours after the car went underwater, meaning there was a significant chance she could have survived if Kennedy had reported it in time. This remains one of the biggest mysteries in American political history. Why didn't Ted Kennedy call the police? How did he end up driving the car into the water? These questions remain unsolved to this day, and the case has generated so much public interest that there are over 20 books written about it, along with countless conspiracy theories. There are many theories that Ted Kennedy deliberately didn't report it to hide an inappropriate relationship with his secretary, that he waited until he sobered up to avoid a drunk driving charge, or that he was in shock after the accident and couldn't respond properly as Kennedy himself claimed. Whatever the case, it was clear that Ted Kennedy's negligence led to his secretary's death. His explanations were full of suspicious elements, and his behavior after the accident was inappropriate in many ways. This incident effectively ended Ted Kennedy's presidential aspirations, as he had been considered a strong contender for the presidency. Mary Jo Kopechne was born in Pennsylvania in 1940 and was working as a political aide in Washington, D.C. At the time, she initially worked as an aide to Florida Senator George Smathers, but a year later in 1964, at age 24, she joined Robert F. Kennedy's staff and worked by his side until his death. She was personally close to Robert Kennedy, and when he ran for president in 1968, she was part of the top-secret campaign team called the Boiler Room Girls, who drafted speeches and tracked election trends. The Boiler Room Girls were reportedly 6 female secretaries, and their workspace had no windows. All 6 were in their 20s and unmarried. After Robert Kennedy's assassination, Kopechne moved to work as a campaign aide for other Democratic politicians. She bounced around various political camps and consulting firms, but couldn't settle in one place, frequently changing jobs every few months. However, she wasn't particularly close to Ted Kennedy or working under him. From July 18 to 19, 1969, Ted Kennedy planned to participate in the Edgartown Yacht Club regatta races. Kennedy rented a cottage on Chappaquiddick Island across from Edgartown and invited the 6 Boiler Room Girls who had worked under Robert Kennedy to a party there. Mary Jo Kopechne attended this party. Ted Kennedy, who caused this incident, was a 37-year-old Massachusetts U.S. Senator at the time, the only surviving son of Joseph Kennedy, and a leading candidate for the 1972 presidential election. Since childhood, Ted Kennedy enjoyed partying and drinking with other upper-class Northeast establishment kids from similar backgrounds. Ted Kennedy organized yacht races and parties from July 18, 1969, on Martha's Vineyard Island in Edgartown, Massachusetts, and on nearby Chappaquiddick Island, just a few hundred meters away. Kennedy planned to participate in yacht races with close friends in Edgartown from July 18, 19. And during the night between the 2 racing days, he planned to throw a party at a remote cottage he rented on Chappaquiddick Island. Ted Kennedy invited 6 female secretaries, the Boiler Room Girls, who had worked for his brother Robert Kennedy, to the party. Mary Jo Kopechne attended this party. All the Boiler Room Girls members were unmarried women in their 20s. 6 men also attended the party, including Ted Kennedy's close friends and his driver. All 6 men who attended the party were married. Kennedy and his friends testified that, contrary to public misconceptions, there was no inappropriate physical contact. Mary Jo Kopechne apparently had 5 drinks and was quite intoxicated. According to Ted Kennedy's testimony, Mary Jo Kopechne asked Ted Kennedy to drive her back to her hotel, which Ted accepted. At around 11:15 p.m. on July 18, he asked his driver Crimmins for the car keys and left the cottage driving his mother's 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88. Ted Kennedy usually had his driver do the driving and rarely drove himself. However, according to testimony from other Robert Kennedy secretaries who attended the party, the Boiler Room members were very happy and excited to reunite after a long time, and Mary Jo Kopechne never said she was leaving. Also, Mary Jo's purse, hotel key, and other belongings were left at the party. The party continued until dawn the next day, and everyone except Mary Jo and Ted Kennedy stayed at the party until dawn. Ted Kennedy, with Mary Jo Kopechne as a passenger, headed north, and at a fork in the road he should have turned left toward the ferry dock to get to Edgartown, where her hotel was located. However, Ted Kennedy turned right at the fork and the car headed in the complete opposite direction from the hotel. Continuing this way, they reached the wooden dike bridge about 4 kilometers from the cottage, located at the eastern tip of Chappaquiddick Island. The dike bridge at the eastern end of Chappaquiddick Island was an old wooden bridge so precarious that it would shake significantly even when driving at 30 kilometers per hour, and it had no guardrails, making it dangerous with occasional accidents. But drunk Ted Kennedy, unaware of this danger, tried to cross the bridge quickly, and within seconds the car carrying Kennedy and his secretary plunged into the cold seawater. Kennedy, who had been a football player in college and regularly exercised, was able to swim out of the car immediately, but Mary Jo Kopechne couldn't swim and was too intoxicated to escape. Ted Kennedy testified that water immediately filled the car, and he thought Kopechne had drowned right away from swallowing too much water. Ted Kennedy claimed he sat on the riverbank to catch his breath briefly, then jumped into the seawater 7-8 times trying to rescue Kopechne. However, according to his account, it was 1 a.m., so he couldn't see Kopechne clearly underwater. The current was about 1.5 knots, and the water was cold, making it impossible for him to save Kopechne. Eventually, about 15 minutes after the accident, Ted Kennedy gave up trying to rescue Mary Jo Kopechne and left the scene, walking back to the cottage where the party was being held. On his walk back, he passed 4 houses and an emergency fire station. But Ted Kennedy didn't visit any of these places to ask for help and went straight to the cottage. When Ted Kennedy arrived at the party scene, he didn't tell any of the other guests about the accident and quietly called his 2 closest associates. They were Joe Gargan and Paul Markham. These 2 men would become deeply involved in this incident, and besides Ted Kennedy himself, would know the most about what happened. Joe Gargan, Joseph F. Gargan Jr., 1930-2017, was Ted Kennedy's cousin. Joe Gargan's mother, Agnes Fitzgerald Gargan's older sister, was Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the mother of John, Robert, and Ted Kennedy. He became an orphan when his mother died when he was 6, and his father died when he was 16. Joe Gargan could afford college with his father's inheritance, but after his mother died when he was 6, his great-aunt Rose Kennedy looked after him in place of his deceased mother, and Joe Gargan developed an emotional attachment to his great-aunt's family. He became very close to Ted Kennedy, who was closest in age among his cousins, and worked as Ted Kennedy's closest associate for life. Gargan joined his cousin John F. Kennedy's Senate campaign in 1952, while in college, and worked in his cousin's campaigns until the 1960 presidential election. When his close friend Ted Kennedy entered politics in 1962, he participated in Ted Kennedy's Senate campaign. In 1968, he served as campaign chairman for his cousin Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign. Paul Francis Markham, was Ted Kennedy's classmate, and along with Joe Gargan, one of Ted Kennedy's closest friends. In 1963, he was appointed as Assistant U.S. Attorney by Ted Kennedy's older brother and sitting President John F. Kennedy, which launched his successful career. Ted Kennedy, who arrived at the cottage and called Gargan and Markham, asked for help, saying his secretary had fallen into the seawater. These three men, Ted Kennedy, Gargan, and Markham, took a rental car together to the scene. Gargan and Markham jumped into the seawater 3-4 times trying to save the secretary but failed, just like Ted. The three men then went near the ferry dock to discuss what to do. Gargan and Markham testified that they repeatedly argued that they should report to police and recover the body, but Ted Kennedy refused to report to police. During their conversation, Ted Kennedy jumped into the water and left the scene, swimming 150 meters to his hotel across from the ferry dock. He walked alone to his hotel and slept from around 2 a.m. until sunrise. Later, Gargan claimed that he thought Ted Kennedy's swimming to Edgartown that night was to report to police. After Ted jumped into the water and left, Gargan and Markham took the rental car back to the cottage around 2 a.m. But according to later testimony, Gargan and Markham spent over 30 minutes driving around the island discussing whether to report the accident. Eventually, when Gargan and Markham arrived at the cottage, they told none of the party guests about the accident. After the incident was discovered, Ted Kennedy, Joe Gargan, and Paul Markham made no further detailed statements. These men were law school graduates with law licenses. Ted Kennedy claimed that he was a client of lawyers Joe Gargan and Paul Markham, which meant that any content Ted Kennedy didn't want revealed, or anything unfavorable to Kennedy that Joe Gargan and Paul Markham might testify would be illegal, violating attorney-client privilege. Therefore, Ted Kennedy, Joe Gargan, and Paul Markham, who were all parties and witnesses at the scene before the incident was reported and the body discovered, could legally avoid all unfavorable testimony. The little that Gargan and Markham did testify was mainly added bit by bit over decades after the incident, not from the time of the incident itself. Ted Kennedy, who returned to his hotel and slept, woke up at 7 a.m. and walked down to the hotel lobby, chatting casually with friends around 7:30 a.m., as if nothing had happened. He even talked about yacht racing with friends that morning, showing no concern about the accident caused by his negligence. Around 8 a.m., Gargan and Markham took the ferry to Edgartown and met with Kennedy. Little after 8 a.m., a local man and a 15-year-old boy who were going fishing discovered the car underwater, found the nearest cabin, and reported it to authorities around 8:20 a.m. Within 10 and 20 minutes, police and firefighters arrived at the scene. At 8:45 a.m., Edgartown Fire Department rescue diver Captain John Farrer, equipped with scuba gear, discovered Mary Jo Kopechne's body inside the vehicle. It took about 10 minutes to recover the body. After retrieving the car, police matched the license plate and confirmed it belonged to Ted Kennedy's mother, then called Ted Kennedy and ordered him to come to the police station. When discovered, the vehicle was completely flipped upside down, but the water was so shallow that parts of the car body, including the rear wheels, were above the water surface, and police could approach the vehicle without diving equipment and sit on the rear bumper. The dike bridge was only about 20 meters long, and based on tire marks remaining on the guardrail, the vehicle appeared to have fallen from the beginning of the bridge and flipped over after hitting the ground, or shallow bottom. A purse belonging to Rosemary Cricket Keogh was found in the retrieved vehicle, initially leading police to believe the body was Rosemary Keogh. Rosemary Keogh was another member of the Boiler Room Girls. When asked why her purse was found in the vehicle, Rosemary Keogh said she had ridden in the vehicle for personal reasons before the accident on the day of the party. Meanwhile, Ted Kennedy was discussing damage control over the incident by payphone with close associates and lawyers, but didn't reveal that he was the driver. Upon hearing that police had discovered his car and Kopechne's body, Ted Kennedy went to the Edgartown police station at 9:50 a.m. with Markham. At the same time, Gargan informed the Boiler Room Girls members about the incident. As soon as he arrived at the police station, Ted Kennedy asked to use the phone, and the police, treating the sitting senator and leading presidential candidate with deference, escorted Ted to the chief's office to use the phone freely. In the chief's office, Ted Kennedy could freely make phone calls with his associates. After the calls, Ted Kennedy admitted to Chief Dominic Arena that he had caused the accident. Police Chief Arena wrote up a statement. Ted Kennedy gave his statement with Markham present in his capacity as a lawyer. Ted Kennedy accepted the content of the written statement, but refused to sign it. Moreover, the statement was inadequate, omitting mentions of the party. But Chief Arena asked no additional questions beyond what Ted Kennedy voluntarily stated. While Ted Kennedy was at the police station, Ted Kennedy's friends were calling lawyers and Kennedy family retainers to discuss how to handle the legal response. Ted Kennedy left the police station after just dozens of minutes and was already boarding a plane to leave the island by noon. Ted Kennedy then went directly to the family compound in Hyannis, across from Chappaquiddick Island. Kennedy family retainers also gathered at this compound. Although there were calls for an autopsy to determine why Kopechne died, for unknown reasons, local police refused to autopsy Kopechne's body and determined her cause of death as drowning. Just 4 days later, Kopechne's funeral was held as a simple family affair, and Kopechne's cause of death became forever unknowable. Instead of reporting to police or calling the bereaved family, Ted Kennedy first called his associates and lawyers to discuss how to handle the incident well, avoid legal judgment, and minimize the impact on the 1972 presidential election, an outrageous course of action. Even while police were working to remove the secretary's body from Ted Kennedy's car, Ted Kennedy was secretly on payphones with his lawyers, diligently working out legal responses. The morning after the incident, various figures who had served the Kennedy family since John F. Kennedy's time gathered at the Kennedy family compound in Hyannis, a small town on the Massachusetts mainland across from Chappaquiddick Island. Ted Kennedy arrived there shortly after noon. They gathered here to avoid media attention. They began discussing how to avoid legal judgment for Ted Kennedy and save his political career. The defense team that gathered at the Kennedy home had impressive credentials. Former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, City University of New York American History Professor Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy administration spokesman and press secretary and former Senator Pierre Selinger, Kennedy speechwriter Ted Sorensen, Kennedy Brothers scheduler in 1968, Robert Kennedy campaign chairman Kenneth O'Donnell, Kennedy Brothers special counsel and speechwriter Richard F. Goodwin, lobbyist and international lawyer Milton Gritzman, John F. Kennedy campaign chairman Stephen E. Smith, California Congressman John Tunney, and other elites who had worked in government and courts. First, they argued that Ted Kennedy needed to create the best possible alibi to avoid the incident. Following their advice, Ted Kennedy tried to create evidence that he wasn't at the scene by wandering around the hotel lobby right after the incident, and even suggested creating an alibi claiming that Mary Jo Kopechne, not himself, was driving the accident car. But the lawyers rejected Ted Kennedy's proposal as too outrageous. Speechwriters like Kenneth O'Donnell, Ted Sorensen, and Stephen Smith discussed what tone Ted Kennedy should use to explain his negligence to voters, while Milton Gritzman and Robert McNamara worked to create subtle legal arguments that would keep Kennedy out of jail, and contacted newspaper owners and Massachusetts local police. They knew to minimize and cover up the incident as much as possible. Nevertheless, the media reported on the Chappaquiddick incident, and the controversy spread widely. About a week after the incident, on July 25th, a court hearing was held at the Massachusetts District Court. Ted Kennedy arrived at the courthouse with his pregnant wife. During the hearing, he pleaded guilty to the charge of leaving the scene of an accident. Kennedy's lawyers argued for a suspended sentence, and the Massachusetts prosecutors also agreed to a suspended sentence, citing Ted Kennedy's character, reputation, and young age. The court hearing was over in just 10 minutes. After remaining silent for a week following the court hearing, Ted Kennedy delivered a live televised speech called Chappaquiddick, written by his top speechwriters. In this explanatory speech, Ted Kennedy completely denied allegations reported by some media outlets, including drunk driving, and claimed that he had done his best to save his female secretary. At the end of the speech, he essentially passed the buck to Massachusetts residents, saying that whether he should continue serving as a senator was for the voters to decide, and he even went so far as to subtly compare himself to historical figures like Charles Sumner and Daniel Webster. Public opinion was greatly inflamed, and the speech had a terrible backlash, causing most Americans to view Ted Kennedy as arrogant and dishonest. The day Ted Kennedy's court hearing and explanatory statement were released was the day after Apollo 11 achieved humanity's greatest accomplishment, the first moon landing, and returned to Earth. It was a strategy to bury the story as much as possible by taking advantage of the media's and citizens' attention being focused on Apollo 11. The public was outraged by Ted Kennedy's behavior, which seemed to show no concern for the welfare of his unjustly deceased female secretary or the grief of her family, and appeared solely focused on keeping his Senate seat and his future presidential prospects. Public opinion grew, demanding that Ted Kennedy receive proper judgment, be stripped of his Senate seat, and be imprisoned. But the Massachusetts state authorities handed down what amounted to a slap on the wrist. Ted Kennedy's defense team argued that he should receive a light punishment because he was young at 37 with plenty of room for rehabilitation, that he was sufficiently remorseful for his crime, and that his criminal record was clean. The prosecution also fell for this logic, and retiring 63-year-old Judge James Boyle handed down a meaningless sentence of the legal minimum, 2 months in prison with a 1-year suspended sentence and a 16-month driver's license suspension. This ruling was highly controversial because Ted Kennedy showed hardly any remorseful attitude, and more importantly, Ted Kennedy was actually a repeat offender who had been ticketed multiple times for drunk and reckless driving. During his college years in the 1950s, he had been caught in Virginia for a high-speed chase trying to outrun police, and he had been fined multiple times before and after for reckless driving charges. But Judge James Boyle was unaware of this, and made the absurd ruling that imposing excessive punishment would be unfair because Ted Kennedy had been an exemplary driver. Public opinion became extremely negative. A Harris poll showed that 68% of the public said tragedies like the Chappaquiddick incident could happen to anyone, but at the same time, 4 out of 10 voters agreed that Ted Kennedy should never again hold major public offices like the presidency or Senate seat. In a January 1969 Gallup poll for the 1972 Democratic presidential primary, Ted Kennedy had an overwhelming lead with 45%, far ahead of former Vice President Hubert Humphrey's 21%, Senator Edmund Muskie's 17%, and Senator Eugene McCarthy's 5%. However, in an October 1969 poll by the same organization, after this incident, his support had dropped 18 percentage points to 27%, trailing Humphrey's 29% and in a tight race with Muskie's 24%. By May 1970, his support had fallen even further to 8%. In the 1970 midterm elections, Ted Kennedy essentially turned his re-election into a vote of confidence by saying he would step down from the Senate if voters wanted him to. Of course, considering that Massachusetts was Kennedy family territory, with strong organization and was one of the most Democratic strongholds, there was no possibility of Ted Kennedy losing. This was essentially a predetermined response. Ted Kennedy won re-election by an overwhelming margin as he expected, but while he received 1,907 votes for 74.26% in 1964, in his 1970 re-election he got 1,202,056 votes, 500,000 fewer votes, and his vote share dropped 12.1 percentage points to just 62.16%. This meant that 3 out of 10 Massachusetts voters who had trusted Ted Kennedy in 1964 had lost faith in him. Even during Watergate, die-hard Republicans drove around with bumper stickers saying nobody drowned in Watergate. That's how big a scandal this was. Ted Kennedy ultimately had no choice but to not run in the 1972 presidential election. He supported his close associate, South Dakota Senator George McGovern, and helped him secure the presidential nomination. McGovern offered Ted Kennedy the vice presidential slot, but Ted Kennedy had to decline considering the fallout from the Chappaquiddick incident. He was also considered for the 1976 presidential race, but was again held back by this incident. Ted Kennedy was elected as Senate Majority Whip for the Democrats in 1969, becoming the second in command of the Democratic leadership, but due to the aftermath of this incident, he lost the respect of his fellow senators and suffered the shocking defeat of losing his whip position to Senator Robert Byrd by a vote of 31-4 in just 2 years. In 1971, Ted Kennedy remains the shortest-serving Democratic Senate Majority Whip to this day. In the 1980 election, Ted Kennedy criticized Jimmy Carter and threw his hat into the ring for the Democratic primary, but what everyone expected happened, and he sank because of this incident. In a 1979 interview with star anchor Roger Mudd before announcing his presidential run, when Mudd criticized Ted Kennedy's inadequate explanation during the incident, Ted Kennedy lost his temper and made the mistake of shouting at Mudd. After this incident, his image recovery was impossible, and despite support from dozens of current and former senators, various labor unions and governors, he was soundly defeated by Jimmy Carter in the primary. In 1984 and 1992, Ted Kennedy was again mentioned as a presidential candidate, but he ultimately couldn't run in the general election because of this incident. He had to remain just an eternal potential presidential candidate until his death in 2000. Related to Watergate, according to secret documents released in 2010. Richard Nixon considered this a golden opportunity to destroy Ted Kennedy, whom he feared most as a political opponent, and dispatched secret agents disguised as reporters to Chappaquiddick Island. However, there was virtually no substantial gain, and since Ted Kennedy collapsed on his own, Nixon didn't need to lift a finger. The bereaved family generally reacted critically to Ted Kennedy's inadequate response. Ted Kennedy called Mary Jo Kopechne's parents immediately after the incident to inform them of their daughter's death. But he didn't tell them that he was the one who killed her, which angered the Kopechne parents. Ted Kennedy paid $441,000 in compensation to Kopechne's family, but it wasn't provided directly, it was paid through an insurance company instead. And there was no expression of regret. Even in 1994, long after the incident, Kopechne's parents said, "We've received a handwritten apology letter from a member of the Kennedy family, but we've never received a single apology letter or word of apology from Ted Kennedy himself." They criticized Ted Kennedy and complained that Ted Kennedy and the Kennedy family's response was far from adequate to console the unjustly deceased Kopechne, and they claimed they never felt that justice had been served. In 2015, Kopechne's cousin wrote a book called Our Mary Jo, which brought the case back into the spotlight. Kopechne's parents lived quietly after the incident until the husband died in 2003 and the wife in 2007. This incident was also a personal tragedy for Ted Kennedy, and caused him to suffer from PTSD until his death. Since 1963, Ted Kennedy had severe psychological after-effects from the deaths of his 2 brothers and his own plane crash, but when he unintentionally killed his female secretary in a car accident and received social condemnation on top of that, he became completely mentally devastated. He personally suffered from severe depression, and after the 1980 presidential primary, which he couldn't run in due to being held back by this incident, his depression worsened and he drank endlessly until he couldn't drink anymore. Many analyses suggest that the after effects of this incident greatly influenced Ted Kennedy's reckless alcohol abuse and sex addiction. Most of all, Ted was most sorry to his father Joseph P. Kennedy, who was on death's door from a stroke. Having to tell his father that all 3 sons had left before him and that he himself was forever barred from pursuing the presidency was the most painful experience of his life, Ted Kennedy recalled. Ted had to tell his father directly, "Dad, I killed a woman," and Joseph Kennedy was so shocked he couldn't say anything and died within a few months. Although it was death from a long-standing illness, Ted Kennedy believed his father had died suddenly from shock at his scandal and blamed himself for the rest of his life. In America, when asked to name the worst political scandals in 230 years of American history, this is always mentioned as one of them, remaining as a scandal of the 1960s-70s that stands alongside Watergate. In the 1960s-70s, there was a high perception that the government was scheming and manipulating things behind the scenes after John F. Kennedy's death. And when the last hope of the Kennedy family after all the brothers had died used his power to cover up a death incident, the public was shocked. That perception continues today and remains one of the most well-known past political scandals in America. It particularly had a major impact on Ted Kennedy's historical reputation. The Kennedy family, despite being from a wealthy background, was popular with the American progressive left for their image of caring for the poor and being honest and brave. John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy remain the most respected figures in America's progressive circles. However, Ted Kennedy has a strong image as a coward who used his wealth and power to cover up a fatal accident he caused and escape punishment. And he's often mentioned alongside Richard Nixon when Americans are asked to name past politicians they dislike most. John F. Kennedy's speeches are often compared to Ted Kennedy's Chappaquiddick special speech. And many critics say that while John F. Kennedy's speeches convey progressive vision, courage, and progressiveness, Ted Kennedy's Chappaquiddick speech was nothing more than a brazen excuse relying on power. Many historians compare Ted Kennedy's Chappaquiddick explanation to Richard Nixon's Checkers speech. Even Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Halberstam, who had been a Kennedy family supporter, criticized Ted Kennedy. It was so brazen and vulgar that it completely invalidated all the charm I had felt toward the Kennedy family. Ted Kennedy seemed to have forgotten everything that made the Kennedy family unique. This youngest brother seemed to think he could get anything he wanted because he was a Kennedy. This perception remains valid even after Ted Kennedy's death. In a YouGov Kennedy family public perception poll conducted in connection with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s presidential run, Ted Kennedy was the only family member whose negative ratings exceeded positive ratings. John F. Kennedy had positive ratings of 73 versus negative 12. Jacqueline Kennedy had positive 65 versus negative 11. John F. Kennedy Jr. had positive 56 versus negative 11. And Robert Kennedy had positive 53 versus negative 15, all overwhelmingly positive. But only Ted Kennedy had negative ratings of 35% versus positive ratings of 33. Among voters 65 and older who experienced this incident, unfavorable ratings for Ted Kennedy reached 52%, 28% very unfavorable to 24% somewhat unfavorable. This contrasts with John F. Kennedy receiving 45% very positive, 38% somewhat positive from the same generation. The various questions were raised about why Ted Kennedy drove with his female secretary alone to a deserted wooden bridge in the middle of the night and crashed, and why Ted Kennedy tried to cover up the incident for 10 hours without reporting to police, and it became even more controversial because of the Kennedy name. His brothers John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy were called sex icons of the century, attractive enough to seduce Marilyn Monroe, and Ted Kennedy had that image too, so naturally many people suggested theories that there was a sex scandal or something else, and he delayed reporting for 10 hours to hide it. Ted Kennedy's complete non-response to the flood of conspiracy theories and hypotheses also contributed to escalating the situation. Ted Kennedy refused any explanation of this incident until his death in 2009, saying, "There are over 20 books in circulation, but they're all second-rate tabloid conspiracy theories, and if I respond to them, people will suspect me even more." In Ted Kennedy's 734-page autobiography True Compass, the Chappaquiddick incident is mentioned on at most 4 pages. However, because Ted Kennedy didn't explain, most people thought, what people are saying must be true, which only made Ted Kennedy's image worse. Biography writer John A. Farrell, who wrote about both Kennedy and Nixon, argued in his 2022 biography Ted Kennedy: A Life, that Ted Kennedy's aristocratic personality made the incident worse. In this book, he argued that if Ted Kennedy had honestly reported to police from the beginning, and even requested an autopsy, absurd conspiracy theories wouldn't have spread in the first place, and it wouldn't have become such a fatal flaw for his future presidential prospects. Historian Arthur Schlesinger, who was friendly with Kennedy, even described Ted Kennedy's silence as self-destruction. There are over 20 related books with different hypotheses from each researcher, so it's impossible to know what the truth is. Only Ted Kennedy, buried in the ground, knows the truth. This is the most well-known hypothesis to the public. Ted Kennedy was young with good looks, wealth, power, and fame, so he would have been popular with women of the time. His colorful, even sordid romantic history was well known at the time. He had more complicated relationships with women than his two brothers, who could hardly be called respectable when it came to women, and was almost sex addicted. So the hypothesis emerged that Ted Kennedy had an inappropriate relationship with his female secretary, and deliberately didn't report it to cover it up. There are conspiracy theories that he deliberately killed her to hide her pregnancy, and hypotheses that he didn't report the incident because he was worried police would ask about his uncomfortable relationship with the female secretary during the car accident. However, this is also a conspiracy theory that has been refuted over a long period. Mary Jo Kopechne had known Robert Kennedy for a long time, but wasn't acquainted with Ted Kennedy. In fact, the day she had the accident with Ted Kennedy was the first time she met Ted. She had personal ties with Robert Kennedy, but there's no evidence of a sexual relationship. Mary Jo Kopechne's bedroom was in a hotel, not the cottage, and many of Ted Kennedy's acquaintances came and went from the cottage, so there was no time or place for a relationship. Originally, Kopechne wasn't Ted Kennedy's female secretary as commonly believed, so there was no possibility of a relationship between them. The counter-argument could be made that Ted Kennedy didn't need to hide anything, because he was famous in social circles for his promiscuous private life. Personal acquaintances of Ted Kennedy like Orrin Hatch and Chris Dodd, whether friends or political enemies, knew Ted Kennedy was an incorrigible sex maniac, but didn't leak it to the media. And while some tabloid media dug into Ted Kennedy's sex life, mainstream media remained silent about his sex scandals until his death. In other words, Ted Kennedy, who had lived a promiscuous sex life his whole life without worrying about public opinion, had no need to cause a major accident to hide an inappropriate relationship with a female secretary. Police also found no evidence that Kopechne had an inappropriate relationship with Ted Kennedy. Kopechne's family completely denied that Kopechne had an inappropriate relationship with Ted Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy did the same. Unfortunately, many American tabloids poured out secondary victimization articles about Mary Jo Kopechne, portraying her as a promiscuous woman who fooled around with Ted Kennedy, and her family had to live in seclusion to avoid criticism from the tabloids. Even Ted Kennedy said he wasn't qualified to walk around with his head held high, considering the unfair attacks Kopechne and her family suffered. This is the second most commonly accepted hypothesis, and cross-examining the testimonies of those involved at the time shows it's somewhat factual. According to historian Arthur Schlesinger, who was at the party, Ted Kennedy drank about 3 glasses of alcohol before getting in the car and was intoxicated. Ted Kennedy was known as a heavy drinker in Washington political circles. After his brother's assassination in 1968, Ted Kennedy's alcohol abuse worsened, and there were few days he didn't drink. There was no reason he wouldn't drink on the day the Chappaquiddick incident occurred. If it was drunk driving, not reporting to police for 10 hours is well explained. In 1969, moral requirements for high-ranking public officials were stronger, and social views on drunk driving were harsh. If Ted Kennedy had killed someone while drunk driving, social condemnation would be severe. And to prevent this from derailing his presidential prospects, he deliberately didn't report it. Additionally, this explains Ted Kennedy getting lost just before the accident, and his incoherent rambling in front of friends right after the accident. However, Ted Kennedy himself denied drunk driving, and while he didn't deny drinking, there are opinions that it's uncertain whether it affected his driving. The license revocation level for intoxication in Massachusetts at the time was 0.15% blood alcohol content, and a man of Ted Kennedy's build would need to drink 8 glasses of alcohol over 34 hours to reach that level. Mary Jo Kopechne's blood alcohol content was also 0.09%, which didn't reach the license revocation level of intoxication. There were arguments in court that Ted Kennedy's drunk driving should be determined, but for unknown reasons, the judge refused to collect testimony from party participants, so it became impossible to ever know whether Ted Kennedy really drank or was drunk enough to impair his driving. Separate from this, when the car fell into the water, an air pocket was formed, and the well-known theory is that the female secretary Kopechne died not from drowning but from suffocation, when the air ran out in the air pocket, or from hypothermia. This theory suggests that Kopechne was alive in the air pocket for several hours and could have been saved if Ted Kennedy had reported quickly. This hypothesis was proposed by diver John Farrer, who recovered Kopechne's body. He claimed that Kopechne's body had her hands gripping the hood and her neck bent back in a gesture as if desperately trying to suck air from an air pocket formed at the back of the car, suggesting the possibility of an air pocket. However, since he's a firefighter but not a medical expert, his words can't be 100% trusted. Conversely, the district attorney handling the case determined it was undoubtedly drowning, noting blood on Kopechne's sleeves when the body was delivered. Ted Kennedy testified in court that the car's front and side windows broke and water rushed in constantly, and Kopechne drowned immediately. Ted Kennedy was able to escape because the left window he was sitting by broke, creating space to escape, but in this case it would be difficult for an air pocket to form. Generally, it's difficult for air pockets to form even in sunken ships, and it's even more difficult to expect a survival-sufficient air pocket to form in a regular passenger car. Even if one formed, it would last about 30 minutes at most, and the diver who first proposed the air pocket hypothesis suggested the possibility of an air pocket lasting only about 30 minutes. In other words, the belief that Kopechne was alive in an air pocket for several hours and could have been rescued if Ted Kennedy had reported it is close to baseless belief. Biography writer John A. Farrell wrote, "If an autopsy had been conducted normally, the fact that Kopechne drowned immediately would have been clear, and then baseless rumors like now wouldn't be circulating." This is a lesser-known theory. Jack Olson, author of The Bridge at Chappaquiddick, 1970, proposed an alternative hypothesis that Ted Kennedy didn't report because he didn't know an accident had occurred. According to Jack Olson's theory, the sequence of events was this. Ted Kennedy and Mary Jo rode together in the car, and the island's deputy sheriff witnessed them both in the car together. Since the most famous Ted Kennedy in Massachusetts being in a car with an unmarried woman could cause misunderstandings, Ted Kennedy had no choice but to get out of the car midway and return to the cottage, asking Mary Jo to drive alone back to the hotel. However, Mary Jo was more intoxicated than Ted Kennedy, and unfamiliar with Chappaquiddick Island's geography, so she took the wrong road to the problematic wooden bridge, where she crashed the car and died alone. Ted Kennedy, who had returned to the cottage, wasn't even at the scene and didn't know an accident had occurred, so he didn't report it in the first place. Several circumstances support this. According to testimonies from people who saw the body, Kopechne's body had a large bruise on her left side, suggesting that when Mary Jo Kopechne's car crashed, she was in the driver's seat and got the bruise from hitting the door. Ted Kennedy also initially told friends that it was Kopechne and not himself who was driving the car. This receives contradictory evaluations as either a completely ridiculous theory or the theory closest to the truth so far. Some experts related to this incident argue that Jack Olson's claims make more sense than Ted Kennedy's own explanation. However, according to testimonies from people at the cottage at the time, Ted Kennedy returned to the cottage soaked and pale, so Jack Olson's theory has been refuted over several years. In Arthur Schlesinger's diary published after his death in 2007, Schlesinger described that Ted Kennedy wasn't in his right mind and cried while intoxicated, so it seems correct that Ted Kennedy was at the accident scene. Jack Olson's book was published 1 year after the incident, before various research on this incident was conducted, so it should be considered that it contains several wrong or inaccurate claims that have since been refuted. Moreover, if this theory is correct, the biggest victim of this incident would be Ted Kennedy. He didn't drive drunk, he left the unmarried woman according to the Pence rule, and it was the secretary who drove drunk, crashed the car into the river, and died alone. Then Ted Kennedy would have no reason to deliberately lie. Jack Olson wrote that Ted Kennedy had no choice but to lie to hide his affair with Mary Jo, to protect his marriage, but the fact that Mary Jo Kopechne wasn't in an extramarital relationship with Ted Kennedy has been revealed through various later studies. Ted Kennedy claimed that not reporting for 10 hours was due to temporary shock rather than drunk driving or cover-up attempts, and that it was a mistake caused by a combination of grief, fear, doubt, fatigue, panic, confusion, shock. The idea is that after losing his 2 brothers a few years earlier, when death came to him too, he was so terrified that he couldn't think to report to police. However, considering that Ted Kennedy calmly conversed with friends the morning after the accident and meticulously worked to cover up the incident, this lacks credibility. While it might be understandable immediately after the accident, not reporting until the morning after the accident can't be explained by mere shock alone, especially since everyone around Ted Kennedy urged him to report to police. But Ted Kennedy refused.